Hello everyone, welcome back to Hansraj e-Samvaad, a center for digital creation and distribution of knowledge at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. The center is a means to leap towards and harness the benefits of digital India for the students. At Hansraj e-Samvaad, we are here to deliver specialized content based on your syllabus so that any student of Delhi University can watch and prepare for their incoming exams. There are loads of videos uploaded on the Hansraj e-Samvaad YouTube channel and many more are yet to come. So, on this note, let me begin with a new topic, a new lecture series rather, on Azadi, which is a novel by Chaman Nahal, which is a part of the VAC titled Reading Indian Fiction in English. This is a value addition course which is being offered in DU. Previously, I have been taking lectures on the novel Anandmat by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, which are available on the channel. Please feel free to check them out, and I will for sure provide the link below for your reference. And I'll also provide the link to the VAC Culture and Communication, which is another value addition course. The viewers can definitely take a look at that too. I have made a detailed lecture series on that as well. So let me begin now with a new novel which is titled Azadi. So in this lecture, I will touch upon the genre of partition literature firstly. Then I will also briefly discuss about the novel Azadi. So this lecture today, this very first lecture, will be an introductory lecture on this particular novel. The novel Azadi, I can say it's one of the best introductory novels for anyone to read and understand the partition of India, and also to understand the various events which unfolded and how those events unfolded and what changes in the social and cultural fabric were induced because of the hatred between the Hindus and the Muslims during and after the partition. So the novel Azadi, it covers the story of a few families who are living in Sialkot, which is today in the modern day Pakistan. And the novel also shows how these families managed to save themselves during the partition riots which engulfed the entire Punjab area. The novel also shows how people suffered during the partition, how things were changing before the partition, the fears, the aspirations, the hopes, the disappointments of the people surrounding independence and partition, and it also explains in great detail about the various forms, the evil forms of communalism. It also talks about the hardships that people actually felt while crossing over from Pakistan to India. So the novel basically shows one of the main characters. The main character is Lala Kanshiram and his struggles in finding a roof and finding a home after his family has crossed over to India. So the novel also shows what happened in between this journey from Sialkot to Delhi and how they managed to save themselves. Therefore, in short, the novel traces the journey that people had to undertake and the journey from Pakistan for the people who were migrating to India. The novel is written in the sense of realism, which describes the realistic events that actually happened, with the survivors of partition. The novel shows the journey of a family headed by Lala Kanshiram and his journey from Sialkot in Pakistan to Delhi in India. The novel also shows how his family suffered, how they lost their homes, they lost their land, they lost their shop, they lost their daughter, they lost their friends, and they even lost their dignity while traveling to Hindustan after escaping the partition violence in Sialkot in Punjab area in Pakistan. The novel also shows how the partition sowed seeds of hatred and violence between the Hindus and Muslims during the last few months around the partition and around the independence of India. So it is very surprising to see how two religions whose members intermingled together and who respected each other's religion and also celebrated each other's festivals, all of a sudden they start hating each other in the last few months right before the independence of India. These two religions worked together, they lived together in harmony, the children played together. They were vocal against the British Raj in the fight for independence together. But in just a few months' time, it all disappeared, and what appeared forward was hatred, lust, the intention to cause harm, humiliation, and loot the other religion's life, property, and dignity. So the events in the novel shows how the life of a Hindu family in Pakistan got uprooted, and they had to move away from Pakistan to Delhi in India. So the scenes of mass violence, sexual assaults, rapes, murders, loot, robbery inflicted on the Hindus in Sialkot were very similar to the ones which were inflicted on the Muslims way back in Hindustan. The novel, as we know, shows the journey of how one family is trying to save themselves and survives and bring their lives to a new start. The novel follows a linear narrative which describes and begins in January 1947 and goes on till around January 1948. And within the span of these 6 months, the novel shows how Kanshiram's family escaped death, giving up their property in Sialkot, and came all the way migrating to Delhi in this journey. So, while traveling from Pakistan to India, the novelist shows the various stories, the various events, the real events which occurred during the partition. Violence related to sexual assaults on women, murders related to violence in the trains, and the train murders, the train killings, which were very famous, during those times. They were referred to as the ghost trains because the whole trains were filled with people who were dismembered, who were disfigured, who were killed and brutally killed by the by the members of the opposite religion, right? So it all these aspects are shown in the novel in a very realistic manner. It also gives you the answer on how and why partition actually happened and what were the repercussions for the Punjabi people. Chaman Nahal is one of the earliest writers who has dramatized this painful period of Indian history by describing in accurate detail whatever happened after the announcement of partition of India in June 1947, the Mountbatten Plan, right? So the novel also looks as if, and it sounds as if, it's written by a historian rather than, just a simple novelist, right? Because the novel follows realism and the realistic problems and the real events, and the real mood of the people is captured in 1947 in this novel Azadi by Chaman Nahal. So the readers might believe that this is a simple story because the language that Chaman Nahal uses is it's very simple, it's very straightforward, and of course it's not difficult to read. But perhaps what was the most difficult thing is to express the most difficult things and difficult emotions in simple yet telling words, right? So the novelists achieve this. He achieves this, and therefore it would not be wrong to say that Azadi is the best novel to introduce to a reader who wants to get a hang of the partition literature and literature of the Indian partition. This is because, the sense of realism that this novel exudes, it is dramatic and absolutely realistic at the same time, right? And this makes this novel a unique study of the partition of India. I would, in fact, I would even go on to the extent of saying that if anyone wants to understand the social and the cultural aspects of India in 1947, and if anyone wants to understand the real events and the mood of the Indian people in 1947, one can very confidently pick up this novel Azadi and read it. Such is the strength of the realistic narrative techniques that Chaman has employed in this novel, right? So one of the key strengths of this novel is its ability. So the readers would realize that it's the ability of the novelist, of the narrative, to draw the readers into it. So the readers are pulled into the narrative because the narrative is so simple. It is so easy to read. It is so straightforward and yet so provocative and so disturbing and so thought-provoking that it will make the readers think about the scale of the tragedy. The tragedy which is unforgettable, unmeasurable, it's unimaginable, right? So imagine the pain that these families went through and the pain that the Hindus in Sialkot went through for no mistake of theirs when they had to be removed from their homes and their houses where they had been living for generations. And now, what are they forced to? They are forced to migrate to a new land, to Hindustan, to a foreign place, to an uncertain place where they have to start their life from the scratch. I'm extremely sure that any of the viewers, anyone watching this lecture right now cannot even imagine living in their homes, and leaving their homes within a span of a few hours with whatever they could carry or stay at their homes to face murder, death, sexual assault or robbery. This was the extent of tragedy which was caused to countless people, millions of people in the event of the partition of India. This novel also shows how the people of West Punjab had to give up their ancestral property, their homes, their affluent businesses, their well-set businesses, their shops, and somehow save themselves from the rioters, from the murderers, from the communal rioters to cross over the border and find a new life on the other side of the border. right? So the I think the third part of the novel is titled The Aftermath, and it shows how the family of Kanshiram struggles to find a new place after they have settled in Delhi. So the struggle goes on. So struggle is not just about leaving their home, but also in finding a new home. Will they be ever able to find a new home? That is the question that Chaman Nahal asks us and wants us to think of. So the author Chaman actually wants us to understand the futility, the mindlessness, the uselessness of partition as an event in Indian history. The partition of India, as we know, it was a decision taken in absolute haste, absolute hurry, and due to the political failures of the leaders of that time, it caused unimaginable tragedy. Now, there can be several reasons, ascribed to the partition of India, but what is perhaps more important is to understand the extent of the tragedy. What is perhaps more important is to understand the human cost. What about the human cost? This novel tells you about the human cost of the partition of India. Historians and social scientists will very easily tell us about the economic cost, about the material cost of the partition, about the political cost of the partition, about the geopolitical cost of the partition, but what about the human cost of partition? What about the cultural cost of partition? Right? So, to understand these aspects, one has to know the reality of the times and what people went through in partition, and to understand what people actually went through because of the partition, we need to understand literature of the Indian partition. And I very firmly believe that within the sphere of the literature of the Indian partition and within this broad genre of partition literature, it is perhaps Chaman Nahal's Azadi which stands out as most representative novel, or perhaps a novel which represents the reality of the partition, in a very simple, straightforward, yet in a very evocative manner, right? So the novel, as I mentioned, shows the human cost of partition, right? And this is evident in the last few chapters of the novel. In the last few chapters, in the last part, which is titled Aftermath, part number 3, it shows the ruptures on the political front extends to the ruptures on the social front and even within the domestic space. So the ruptures, the fractures of the political areas, of the geopolitical space, and it goes on, it extends to the ruptures and the fractures within the domestic space. It is very evident in the last chapter, and that is chapter number 1 and part number 3. Because we see a complete breakdown of communication, so much so that the characters are confused about what they are feeling. They are not able to communicate with each other. And this loss of property, the loss of sense, is something that Chaman wants us to understand. And all this is a result of the partition of India and this is the human cost of partition, right? But what is the need even to study partition literature? What is the need even to study the partition of the Indian subcontinent as a historical entity? Do you think that there is even a need to revisit the partition? The answer is that we, the people of India, must understand the human cost of partition, and they must understand where our ancestors came from. We, as independent students, as young minds of the University of Delhi, must understand the history that is our own. We must remember history and should not fall in the trap of historical amnesia, because, as the dictum says, and if you know the very popular dictum, if one does not know where he or she is coming from, they do not know where they are actually going ahead. So, on this basis, I would conclude that it is extremely crucial to understand how the partition shaped our consciousness, how the partition has shaped society, how the partition has shaped the current relations between India and Pakistan, and how it will undoubtedly affect the future of our country. Right? So we must pay homage to millions who, for no fault of their own, were forced into this tragedy, into dislocation, into injury and trauma. And that is why on August the 14th, 1947, the government of India, just a few years ago, has recently started observing Partition Horrors Remembrance Day, Vibhajan Vibhishika Divas, in honor of the countless people who lost their lives due to the administrative and the political failures of the government at that time. So it is our responsibility ultimately to remember such people and the contribution of these people to Bharatiya identity. So partition of the Indian continent is perhaps, as we know, it's the biggest geopolitical, social or cultural tragedy that had happened to India in more than 3000 years of its civilization. Right? It is the biggest tragedy, and a tragedy which had affected the current generation as well. Don't think that the partition has only affected the generations, which migrated. It is affecting culturally all of us even today. right? So the partition of India is not a subject which can be inquired simply from a distance. We cannot understand the partition by simply, reading history books. We need to read the literature as well to understand the human cost of this event. The partition is to be remembered, but not to spread hatred. This is the lesson that Chaman Nahal is essentially trying to give us at the end of this huge novel, right? So the partition is to be remembered, but not for hatred, but rather to remember so that we know where we are coming from. So a very simple event which tells us the way in which even 75 years after independence, the partition and its aftermath is still going on, and this event is very much visible in the recent debacle in Bangladesh, where Hindus are massacred, humiliated openly on the streets with no law in order to protect them. This is also an extension of the partition, of the history of the partition, right? So a lot has to be done by the governments of both, Bangladesh and India, to ensure that such events do not occur. But what I'm trying to say is that such events have occurred because of the long partition, because the partition extends beyond 1947, even today in 2025. And the way that partition had created drift between the two communities, the majority Hindu community and the minority Muslim community. And in the case of Bangladesh, it is the exact opposite. Okay, so Bangladesh has minority Hindu community and majority Muslim community. So therefore, to understand these different events, even contemporary events in world history, we must understand and we must acknowledge that the roots of this lies in the partition of India, because, and in fact, I would say that India was not partitioned. Rather, it was the Punjab area which was partitioned and the Bengal area which was partitioned, right? That is why the amount of violence in the Punjab area and the Bengal area is evidently, it is much more than the violence which was inflicted, say in Delhi, or say in any other plains, in any other place in India where Muslims were living, right? So the novel Azadi talks about the Punjab area which was partitioned and takes us on the right to the actual events in the most realistic manner possible. So here I come to the end of the introduction to this novel Azadi by Chaman Nahal, and I also tried to give you a very brief introduction about the partition, of India and about partition literature. In the coming few lectures, I will discuss detailed summaries of all the three parts of the novel. As we know, there are three parts in this novel. Part 1 is titled The Lull, Part 2 is titled The Storm, and Part 3 is titled The Aftermath, right? So we will discuss all this in the subsequent lectures. So stay tuned for more lectures on this novel and keep watching Hansraj e-Samvaad. I will meet you very soon in the next lecture. Thank you. Goodbye for now.